To the PIDE webinar. We are taking up our webinar series again. We do about 2 or 3 webinars a week because we want to bring the best thinkers from around the world as well as within Pakistan to engage with the PIDE so that we can learn and develop a better strategy for Pakistan. Pakistan Institute of Development Economics is a very old think tank. It's a 70-year-old think tank that has been associated with research for development in Pakistan. It has its ups and downs, but it is very much there and doing interesting things. So let me introduce you to our speaker today, Gregg Pascal Zachary. He's a historian, teacher, scholar. He's written some great books. I've read his book, The Endless Frontier, which intrigued me so much. I thought we should hear from this man and see what he has to say. And I see he's an interesting personality. He should tell us a lot about technology and development. I welcome Gregg. Gregg, PIDE, as I said, is a very old think tank and would like to learn from you about technology and development. We all talk about technology and development. We've just made a science policy. And I just commented on it using your book, saying that we need to learn from Vannevar Bush. And that was the motivation for bringing you in. So this is a very exciting topic. I'm interested to learn on this. So Gregg, over to you.
Thank you, Nadeem. Thank you very much. That's exciting to be share with you sometime. It is about 8 a.m. in the morning. I am an early riser, but it is morning for me, and I do appreciate that you are in the evening. Now, Nadeem, if you keep your video on, it's nice to look at something and someone. So if you keep your, thank you. Yes, it gives me a little bit. So basically, I want to thank the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics for inviting me. And thanks to Fad Zulfikar for assisting in preparations. There's 3 parts to my talk. I cast it as an introduction because I'm trying to give a broad overview. I'm not drawing on micro studies. And some of my concepts are not mainstream within the development studies field, but flow out of the history of technological and scientific change and the relationship of the state to those forces. So I'm going to talk about the state and particularly US exploitation of science and technology during and after World War II. I'm going to talk briefly about private capital and civil society and the role that they play in technology and development. And then finally, some comments about geography. Just briefly, I just completed 10 years at Arizona State University, where I was in an academic unit that has a PhD program in development studies. Prior to that, I spent a few years as a consultant to the Gates Foundation, and I also come out of journalism and have taught at other universities as well. I'm born in Brooklyn, so I'm originally a New Yorker who is married to a West African. And Mansour, you can move the slide to the next one. One more. And most of my scholarly knowledge, I try to match with visits to the regions, and principally, I have been on the ground in Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and East Asia. No visits to South Asia. I regret that, but my traveling days have been curtailed. So I kind of straddle disciplines of history, ethnography. I'm very interested in the lived experience of the person undergoing development process. Philosophy, journalism, and political economy. I was a senior writer for the Wall Street Journal for nearly 15 years. And a lot of my knowledge of political economy comes from the practitioner's side. So next slide. Now, next slide. So this may seem pedantic, but we might just throw out, what's a technology? What's a technological system? these concepts are very embedded in the sociology and political economy of technological change and science, but often overlooked in the development field. You know, what good is improving a cricket bat without coincident improvements in the field, the ball, the uniforms, the rules, the methods and means of keeping score? These are all additional technological systems. So you'll often see in the development field, oh, here's a wonderful irrigation system, but the supporting infrastructure isn't there. Another question is, what is development? Leo Marx has a famous essay in 1987 that you can find online. Does improved technology mean progress? Who defines the development agenda, and who even defines what progress is? We have many examples, by the way, of where older technologies are more appropriate than newer ones. I remember a foot-powered sewing machine, hand-powered pumps for water. They can often have value even if they are older. So one concern that everyone has in the development field is unequal outcomes. And one problem with unequal outcomes is technological change, we know from history, spawns processes of creative destruction that often mean there are losers, or we lose certain ways of life because of progress. And so that outcomes may be generally desirable and beneficial, but some members of society don't gain, they may even lose. How do we manage their grievances and disappointments? And often the usual response is with more technology. So, you know, the problem of COVID that we're undergoing now, I've had the booster, I had the first shot, the second shot, and now the booster. And, you know, to the problem of my wanting to not get COVID, the answer is, give me another shot, okay? More technology. The other thing that concerns me, and partly because, you know, I've spent a lot of time with people from traditional societies through my own marriage of more than 20 years to a West African, you know, societies want to sustain traditions, and some traditions are worth preserving. How do you preserve traditions without freezing technological advance? This is a very, very difficult problem. You know, are development issues technocratic purely? Are they purely about technical issues of engineering and science? Or are development questions about values, philosophy, how a society decides what is meaningful, what's the purpose of human life? And if your answer, like mine, is, well, it's a bit of both, then how do you strike that balance between what the technologies allow us to do and what our society, our traditions, our values might dictate for us? So these are prefatory comments. So the core idea of the state, and I'm quite convinced of this from recent scholarly work by a historian in Australia, the state and the technological capacity of a society co-evolve. In pre-modern histories of Europe, we see in Germany, France, and England that nation states increase their power in order to support technological gains. And then those gains in turn strengthen the state's capacity. So in England, you had a big emphasis on ships, in France, cartography, trying to understand, you know, if you're the king of France, you wanted to know where things were in your country. And one way of finding out was hiring cartographers, map makers, and geographers. And so you see different fields begin to grow. Now, in the 19th century, the US government got deeply involved in agriculture. And so that while World War II was a decisive turning point for the US government in relation to science and technology, there was an older tradition that was very important. The US government created land grant universities throughout the middle part and the south of the United States, and in the West too, actually, part of whose obligation was to support science and research into agricultural productivity, farm productivity. University of California, California has the largest agricultural sector in the United States, and UC Davis, which is about 50 miles from where I'm sitting, continues to be an enormous agent of innovation. This occurs to this day. The wine industry, which is very big in California, involves grape growing, involves processing. UC Davis, some 25 years ago, partnered, public-private partnerships, partners with wine growers who are going to benefit commercially from what UC Davis does for them. And yet that kind of subsidy for science and technology for producers is standard in the US. And the first automation revolution in the US comes in the fields by vastly reducing the need for farm labor. And the principle continues of enabling technologies. The last point on that slide, how does government provide enabling technologies for the private sector? This is kind of a classic formulation. So, the state and science co-evolve over time. Let's go to the next slide. And before I get into this, there is a decisive change, World War II, the Second World War, where the United States mobilizes in a very systematic way in an effort to defeat Germany and Japan in a global war, the scientific and engineering strengths of their country, and also of immigrants. The pattern of foreign-born people providing important contributions, vital contributions to the American technological capacities. This begins in the run-up to World War II because Germany's leadership under Hitler is persecuting many of their leading scientists for various reasons, and they leave. They leave to come to the United States, to Britain. Britain also provides a lot of support through its own scientists and engineers who feared being a German invasion of England, and that they left in advance. So in the United States, you have a president, Roosevelt, who's interested in science and technology, and he responds positively to an invitation from a man named Vannevar Bush, who's an engineer, and at the time was the best known designer of electromechanical computers. That's part of his prestige. And Bush creates a system that's centered on the research contract. He had a concept that researchers could stay in the universities they lived in, or they could gather together, but they would be hired under contracts as independent consultants, and they would have their own integrity of their knowledge. They would not be dictated to by government, and they would have their own views and sustain them. And their pay was not contingent on results, it was contingent on effort. So this model of government in an emergency, relying on scientists and engineers to respond in various ways, it spreads all over the world. And to this day, the model of the research contract is very important. The nonpartisan nature. So the notion that even military leaders shouldn't be able to tell scientists what to make. So this is a point of tension during and after World War II. The most obvious example of the leadership of science and technology during World War II was the Manhattan Project. And it became a model for creating a research laboratory and bringing people together to work on urgent problems. So you'll often today hear about climate change. Can we use some of the tools we've learned in the past? How widespread is this? I still think the Knowledge for Development report by the World Bank, and that's 1998, remains a touchstone. And you'll get to keep this. So whoever wants to look at the issues that a critique of that approach, because knowledge for development presumes that technocrats will have political authority and that institutional actors, big business, big government, will do what the technology dictates from an efficiency standpoint, and this is not always the case. Also, people disagree about agendas. So, but that's important. Let's go to the next slide. So, the legacies of the Second World War. And I call it the long war here because, of course, China had a civil war. The war did not end in 1945 in the largest country in the world. It kept going. And it wasn't until 1949 that you see we have two state-led countries, Russia and China, then the Soviet Union. And this led to a great age of state support for technological innovation. In the US, we saw the Manhattan Project, but then in the 50s, we had what was called the space race, missiles and satellites, and then the Apollo program and the moon landing in the 60s. And all of these efforts, but especially Apollo, called upon a wide range of scientists and engineers scattered around the US, partly to ensure political support widely, and also to draw in talent. So basically by the 1970s, when you start to see industrial competition from Asia, in the instance of Japan, begins competing heavily with American and European industries, you start to see this concept of the innovative state. And so the innovative state is the notion that at the highest levels of government, there should be a science advisor or a science and technology advisor, and that science and technology need to have links to industry, private industry, state-owned enterprises, in order for the state and society to remain innovative. And entrepreneurial is another term that Mazzucato also uses, the entrepreneurial state, which is a recognition that sometimes the state is slow moving. So you see a good example, Elon Musk, SpaceX. Well, for decades, until really about 2000, the US space agency, NASA, had a monopoly on space exploration. There was only one agency. It was the space agency of the United States that could go into space. Private individuals could not. Well, that took a change in legislation, and now you see SpaceX create some competition with NASA, and that's part of this entrepreneurial idea. Jeff Bezos has now taken an interest in space and, of course, gone into space. Globally, I'm going to get back now to development issues, but globally, independence movements, decolonization, the Vietnam War, the rise of these export-oriented enclave states on the periphery of China and Japan, particularly Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, the migration of scientists and engineers from the global south to the north. And the whole innovation map globally gets redrawn so that often, you know, if you think of Bangalore and Hyderabad as centers of software excellence, they're not necessarily software excellence to develop India. They're software excellence that fit and fuel global processes of growth. Next slide. So what I start to see historically, and I think in development studies, this is pretty accepted, that nation states everywhere seek to drive development through big science and big projects. On the one hand, so the Aswan Dam in Egypt, the Volta Dam in Ghana, the capitalist turn in People's Republic of China under Deng. And by the end of the 1990s, nearly all nation states are looking for their Nokia or looking to imitate Silicon Valley in pursuit of an innovation cluster that's sustainable. Next slide. So you get, on the one hand, market-led development by multinationals. You get brain circulation to counteract brain drain. You get the so-called supply chain, where production networks that depend on innovations are spread around the world, and that's part of the so-called supply chain problem. There's a vast literature on markets and development. I'm just going to look at one example quickly. And this is really one of the purest instances of what maybe 10 years ago there was a lot of euphoria over. So the rise of mobile phones and mobile finance. In the year 2000, Nigeria had no more than 100,000 working phone lines for a nation of 100 million people. By importing technology and importing managerial expertise, telephony and text messaging by 2010 had revolutionized daily life. They were it's just an enormous transformation. Both in East and West Africa, of course, throughout the world, this is true, but the states, the nation states in sub-Saharan Africa, which nominally were saying they wanted to lead in development, did virtually nothing to achieve this monumental example of leapfrogging. Vast changes in the way in which people live because of mobile phone and texting, and yet the state is not involved at all, even to the point in African countries where the state doesn't even attempt to regulate in any way mobile phone enterprises. Their biggest obligation is to extract taxes from them. So the allure of technocracy, development without politics, the digital world, particularly mobile telecom. There's a belief that this can be repeated in other sectors using the same formula of little government controls, drawing on global technologies that you can just buy, and managerial expertise that you can grow after some tutelage. So, you see something like TikTok and you say, wow, so TikTok's a great example of this, where look, there's a global leader that's emerged in social media, and maybe that's a path for other industries. Why can't Pakistan have its own TikTok? Why can't any number of countries develop a TikTok? Burkina Faso. It's true, you could, it's possible, but there's many reasons to think this mobile story is unique, and that the state and civil society continue to need to do hard work. And we're going to talk a little bit about that hard work. So even if the role of the state in development is smaller than we once believed, the state remains a big player. And we also now believe, and correctly, that civil society should influence the shape of development and should contribute in many different ways, not just once in expressing their views, say, at the ballot. So I'm going to look at targets or trust. Do we set specific goals and achieve them? Or do we trust in the linear model? This is another notion that comes from Vannevar Bush. It was a way of selling science to taxpayers. And it involved basically saying to taxpayers and legislators, you fund science, you fund research, and automatically knowledge will flow downstream to engineers who apply it. And then those engineers will hand that knowledge off to, and those applications off to corporations, state enterprises, and they will then put it into use. That's the linear model. So we're going to look both at targets and at the linear model. Targets, I think, come across, that the state or a large private actor can rally a society around an important development goals. You know, in your own nation, that there have been important technological development goals that have been embraced and achieved. Targets are a tool. They focus resources. And down here, I say they're a clever means of holding technologists to account, because there's a core problem in democratic control or democratic influence over technological development. And that's the problem of expertise, that the legislature, that the civilian military leader, the civilian political leader, they don't understand how packet switching works. They don't understand how do you create a 100 gigabyte disk drive. They don't know anything about this. So how can they chart the progress and hold to account scientists and engineers that they are giving a lot of money to? Well, one way to do it is to ask that community of scientists and engineers to sign up for clear aims, as opposed to freewheeling inquiry based on their own curiosity. Okay, so the trouble with targets. The next slide. One thing is many techno-scientific problems, development challenges are so complex that targeting mass complexity. Let's take HIV/AIDS. Let's take malaria. Both of those had targets. We wanted a vaccine to stop AIDS from happening. We wanted a vaccine to prevent malaria from occurring. It turns out that just mobilizing resources wasn't enough. These were very, very hard. Existential threats like climate change, hunger, conflict are easy to identify but difficult to resolve through a target. And there are many examples of failed targets. So targeting has benefits and targeting has limitations. So the simple beauty of the linear model is, oh, just give scientists money, just give engineers money, let them follow their curiosity. And then when it comes time for their inventions, their applications, their insights to be used, oh, you don't need to do anything either as a government or a civil society. There'll be entrepreneurs, there'll be capitalists, basically, who will sign up to finance, produce, and distribute these innovations that are going to help develop. So, Procter & Gamble, packaging products for sale in sizes that poorer people can afford. Single-use packaging. Well, that wasn't something that Procter & Gamble and Unilever and your national South Asian consumer products companies could just do. They had to learn how to do it, and that involved marshaling some engineering. Let's go to the next slide. Good. So if you were to read, you'll find this online, Science, the Endless Frontier. Vannevar Bush writes a report in 1945 that basically argues governments should spend enough money on science and engineering to improve, to ensure a flow of knowledge that would improve health, increase prosperity, and enhance security. Health, prosperity, and security. And to this day, that is the bargain that governments make with the scientific and engineering communities in their domains. And for better or worse, governments rise and fall on how well does this simple model, science discovers, engineers and inventors apply, capitalists finance, produce, and distribute, how well does that map onto the development agenda? Because often it doesn't. And then when it doesn't, you don't have any tools. Now, in the case of the US, the US has such resources to throw at problems that it almost seems as if even in failure, you get some benefits from this massive mobilization. And right now, the US is going through a big expansion in spending on R&D. Now, what's the first, this is never said, no one has ever said this, I'm not kidding, even though it's barely 8:30, I've remembered this. And I've kind of thought, isn't this interesting? Because progressives in the United States, liberals in the United States, want more spending on science and engineering. Well, guess what? That means more scientists and engineers from South Asia, China, Africa, have to move to the US because we're out of scientists and engineers. So in some sense, when you watch the US go through these very big expansions, National Institutes of Health, a new development research center for COVID and infectious diseases, of course, the National Science Foundation, DARPA, all these different agencies, you start expanding their budgets greatly. And one of the knock-on effects that no one talks about is this continues the flow of people into the US from the rest of the world. And what I want to know is, why isn't there more concern about this in the United States? There is not. But that's what we're seeing is an expansion. And this model in the US tends to be based on more. Scientists and engineers lobby for more money, more support, and they lobby for less scrutiny over their outcomes. So the National Institutes of Health, which has a budget in the 30s of billions, it's approaching 40 billion now, that has no deliverables. There's no promise of benefits to a society, and it doesn't work on healthcare solutions. It just works on healthcare research. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Because I'm getting close to being able to let you ask questions and have a discussion. Now, interestingly, while the US just keeps spending more and more on basic research, disconnected from solutions and from the development needs of people, we have an alternative model that is best seen in the case of South Korea. So South Korea first said, let's imitate South Korean companies on purpose, and I'm talking about Samsung, Hyundai, on purpose, as a business strategy, copied the intellectual property of American companies in particular, and said to themselves, the penalty we will pay is worth the benefit we gain. So Samsung, Hyundai, the Chaebol of Korea, they've all paid billions of dollars after the fact to US companies, but it got them into markets. Amazingly, South Korean consumer electronics companies have far exceeded Sony of Japan, for instance. They are now a reasonable player in autos, but of course, Samsung in mobile phones. The position of the South Korean government is we want to spend as little as possible on science and engineering research. Instead, let's educate researchers to draw on widely available research in English, which of course is not their native language, but many people speak English and read English. And so it's a free rider opportunity. And the evidence shows that the ability to absorb knowledge and put it into use for development and innovation is a very different skill and capacity than generating research outcomes that are disconnected from your society. So why bother doing that? Maybe the South Koreans are onto something. So that's a question for discussion. One of the downsides in South Korea is go to the next slide. One of the downsides in South Korea is crony capitalism. We see repeatedly that the heads of Hyundai, Samsung, the big national champions that are dominating global markets, they're caught up in scandals about bribing government leaders in South Korea, and they continually get arrested and go to jail, and it's a cycle. The other thing about South Korea is, of course, the U.S. defense umbrella, the cost and benefits of that. But that's something to think about is the South Korean model interesting for a country like Pakistan, who actually has very advanced scientists in esoteric subject areas, but getting someone to, say, design a new cell phone or a new iPad, that's not as important as generating PhDs that in physics, say. So let us go to the next slide. There's only two more. This is really the last one. I just want to throw this out as a third consideration. And again, the area of development studies has looked at geography, particularly around landlocked nations. And all I want us to think about is, in the subject of technology and development, do we need to pay more attention to location and the kind of neighborhood you're in? The other thing is Peter Hall in his famous magisterial Cities and Civilization, argues that once a city or region gains a lead, it's hard to lose it. Detroit has declined a lot. Tokyo isn't as important economically as it used to, but the decline tends to be limited because of what the economist Paul David calls path dependence. So, this is, let me go to the last slide. Again, I want to thank the Institute and of course, Nadeem and his title, the Vice-Chancellor, as well as FOD for helping. I wanted to leave at least 20 minutes for discussion, and I hope that areas I didn't cover, we can address now or go into more depth. Nadeem, thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. That's a wonderful talk. I appreciate it. A number of questions come to my mind, and I hope people will have questions. People, please raise your hands. I'll take you in as soon as you raise your hand. We must have a good conversation with Greg. Greg, I just want to ask, yes, it happened as you described so well, that US took a leap in the Second World War, the Manhattan Project, and then Vannevar Bush's Endless Frontiers, etc. US has led science now for well over a century, and China is trying to gain ground and trying to deal with the US. I looked up China's science policy a little bit. They seem to be focusing on research, and they seem to be trying to get into the mode that the US is, but they're not catching up. So first question, do you see China catching up, or what is China doing right or wrong?
It's interesting you ask about this, Nadeem, because I am a bit of a dissenter around the notion that because of the PRC's high level of control over their society, that they'll be able to scale solutions in biomedical, solutions about problems on the web. The one area that there's a lot of attention is AI, artificial intelligence. This is very hard to evaluate because AI is an enabling technology, and it's not always clear, what is it enabling. But in other areas, and I'm not thinking now, I'm setting aside defense, military applications. In other areas, it does still seem to be a challenge for the Chinese in two ways. One is the relative lack of academic freedom and the large community that's outside of China. This is a tension that's hard to resolve. We know in history that in the 1940s and 50s, there was great fear that science didn't require freedom. Science didn't require the kind of comforts that a liberal democracy affords. That the Soviet Union could just dictate to its scientists what to do. It could threaten them, and they would do the right thing. Well, that worked for a while. You can get short-term benefits from coercion. And I think that President Xi, it's a tough balance between how much top-down pressure can you put on the research community. The second thing is that the Chinese research community has been beset by corruption in the activities of scientists, whether it's outright fraud or cheating, or whether it's cronyism in research jobs. That's, I think, these are both warning signs. The importance of the multinational companies in China is another area where American companies, European companies are increasingly reluctant to share science and technology, particularly around engineering, with the Chinese government. The other thing is about the size of markets. I simply don't agree that large markets ensure success. In fact, what can happen, and you see it in India to some extent, where protectionist measures just mean that your society is using inferior products. You are using devices and systems that are made in your country, but perhaps they're of lesser quality. That doesn't mean it's terrible. Brazil ran into the same problem. And so how do you balance that? So I think it's very difficult, but I think the Chinese government has some really large challenges if it expects to become a world leader in science and technology-based innovation.
Okay, let me bring in Shahid. Shahid, you have a question? Shahid, can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Oh, okay. First of all, Greg, thank you for this very insightful lecture. I am Shahid Mahmood, research fellow at PIDE. I have two questions, short ones. The first one relates to, I'm sure you've heard of something, the Antikythera mechanism, that wonderful clock, which the Greeks built about more than 2,000 years ago. And it could very, very, very precisely measure the celestial bodies and their movements. Now, the question is, why couldn't the Greeks use that, or do we have any evidence what they were using it for? And why couldn't technology be a base in that kind of society from where they could make a jump, like China or maybe South Korea? And the second part, it's related to something, it's more of a controversy, more of a puzzle thing. I would say controversy. Jared Rubin, he discussed it in his book. It was about the adoption of printing press in the Osmanic Caliphate, or the Turkish Empire, I would say. The other word for that is. So his prognosis or his thesis was, or his thinking was that the printing press came to Europe in early 13th century or early 14th century, but it wasn't allowed in Turkey or the Osmanic Caliphate till the 16th or 17th century, and that led to technological depletion or backwardness, I might say. So is that true? Because there seems to be a puzzle around it. And what does that mean for adoption of technology in societies? Thank you.
Yes, Shahid, put your video on while I can see you when I'm trying to answer. It might give me some clues if you're willing.
My apologies, Greg, but
you
on my
just have
desktop.
audio. No problem.
I just have audio.
Okay.
My apologies.
One, discontinuities are very apparent when you look at in the long duration of the past. We do see, for instance, that the so-called Arab world had vast strengths in science and literacy and knowledge of the world, 800 years ago. And of course, the traditional Chinese societies during the period when Europe was in the so-called Middle Ages, China had all kinds of technology. So one thing that I think this suggests is we should be paying attention to the creative destruction part. How you protect the losers, how you protect people who say, I'm not losing, but I liked using a telephone, or I liked having a certain kind of bicycle or a certain type of technology. It was comfortable. And so if we look at the revival of, say, foot-powered sewing machines, which are very interesting, and South Asia makes a lot of them. They're essentially Singer sewing machines. And you might say, well, it would be much better if we had a national grid that was reliable. But you might wait a long time for that. So you revive an older technology that's appropriate. So one thing discontinuities tell us is that you can leave behind as a society valuable technologies, valuable innovations that helped you develop or helped you maintain a certain stability, and that you may need to go back and get them. In the US, we're reviving ferries, for instance, boats to take people to work, because another thing that US did was rip out trains, urban trains, in order to replace them with cars. The car company, actually General Motors, bought the train companies, destroyed them, so people had to use cars. So the discontinuities that you're talking about are grand scale discontinuities. But I think they point to this need to think about, what are you giving up when you're embracing something new? You know, a good example was watching television through a VCR, you know, a little videotape. Well, in places I've been, people would gather to watch a movie. You know, now maybe you're watching them on your phone in an isolated way. And so you can start to see some of the trade-offs. Now, your point about the printing press is very interesting, because no question that the acceleration in Western Europe in 1600s, 1700s, the Industrial Revolution, that the printing press and its embrace and adoption is a good example of how you can miss out on a wave of innovation and development. And I think that you are looking at these puzzles in your own region's history of what wasn't absorbed, what was pushed back. You know, in the US and Britain, Europe, we call this Luddism, a resistance to new technologies. Now, some of this resistance can be helpful, but when societies close themselves off, you often see deleterious effects. I'll just say one thing about imitation. Nearly all the American industry in the 1800s, or okay, it's 200 years ago, was stolen from Europe. The American companies would send people to France, Germany, and Britain. They would try to steal designs. They would try enormous amount of borrowing. And imitation is important. And I think that where we see this most importantly is in pharmaceutical development, where countries like India, South Africa, just said, you know what, we're going to ignore your intellectual property for AIDS drugs or some other drugs, and we're just going to make them. We're going to reverse engineer them, and you then decide what to do. I think that with COVID, it should be the same thing. Sure, you can wait for a treaty. You can wait for Pfizer to tell you it's okay, or you can just re-engineer their drug and try to keep up that way and see what they're going to do. But imitation is only occurs when there's openness. It only occurs when there's openness. This is one of, by the way, that little sound. We now receive many, many phone calls from robots and people in China in the US. That seems to be, so I never answer the phone anymore because it's never from anyone I want. So this seems to be like a step backward to me. But so Shahid, very good questions. Keep asking them, try to develop research and advocate around them, because openness to new technologies that are tied to development gains, that's important. You still have to absorb them in your own way, but to shut them out entirely may be unwise, is the historical lesson.
Greg, I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned something about the World Bank Knowledge and Development Report from 1998. And we in this part of the world, and you've been to Africa a lot, you know the place. I think we have kind of paid homage to technology and science, but we have a very mercantilist approach to science. We seem to think that science is something that can develop us rapidly. We don't want to pay the price of learning science. We want to mercantilize and commercialize science very quickly. Our universities, for example, have a department of commercialization, even though we have no research, but a department of commercialization. But related to this is the issue of bureaucracy. What I read of Vannevar Bush, and I remember reading something on the Manhattan Project too, and Feynman's paper books, which are very readable. And one thing that came out very clearly to me, and I love your comments on this, that the Manhattan Project was a very strange project in the sense that they clubbed together the best intellectuals of the country and from a wide variety of disciplines, right? Von Neumann, Feynman, and all kinds of people, Oppenheimer, etc. And then they got them to work under the supervision of the military. Yet, even though, as you said, the linear model was at work, but the scientists were given considerable freedom. Even Feynman's pranks were kind of overlooked by the military. Military did not treat them like boot camp people. So there was a kind of a light-headed science there that these guys engaged in, and they made the Manhattan Project. But now what we've got is bureaucracy of science taking over. We try and repeat the Manhattan Project here. World Bank comes and sets up a technology policy or something like that, but I find that there's a lot of bureaucracy there. So how does your linear model work with the bureaucracy? And what do you think about mercantilism of science?
Well, these are really very important questions. And there's no question that the United States and Bush himself, Vannevar Bush himself, had a strong belief in individual freedom and enterprise. And what Bush used to say is, I don't want to circumscribe the individual in any way or as little as I can. And so this notion that people should have freewheeling, not be overly burdened by bureaucracy, this is part of what you might say is animating, driving some of the PhDs who start companies like Page and Brin at Google, for instance. They don't want to stay in the academic system. And I think that there's two things that I see in developing countries that feed into this problem of bureaucracy is, one is status, that the professor has a lot of status, he has a steady income, people defer to him, and he doesn't have any risks to take, and he doesn't want to take any. So the problem of status, that you want to be in a lab, say, where there are a lot of people under you, because that's what shows you're important. That there's a lot of people waiting for you to make a decision so they can do things. And that makes you feel really good. You're in a society that really values that. Hey, there's a long line outside your office. These are all people that are waiting to hear from you. Do they do this? Do they do that? And so the bureaucracies often grow in response to the needs for status. In the US, there's still a bit more emphasis, and in say even in Germany, the eccentric, the loner, the person that wants to build a research organization from scratch. And I think part of the issue with knowledge for development and the World Bank is the imperative to include high-level government agencies in everything they do. So if you're going to do something, you need to get the Ministry of Science involved or the Ministry of Education involved. And unfortunately, these top-heavy government agencies often do stifle the potential that is undeniably there. And then the other thing is the cult of bigness, that people are thinking that we should be doing big projects. not small ones. And so this cult of bigness that, hey, we've got hundreds of people working on this, and this also could be, a symptom of this giantism. We want to do something giant. Now, with that said, Nadeem, there's also an additional problem: the structure of physics versus the structure of other fields. There's no getting around that the field of physics, broadly construed, had these amazing advances in the area of nuclear power. And this threw people off because the model of the linear model actually does apply to the world of nuclear physics. You really don't get the applications if you don't have that basic science. Very few other areas don't, work this way. So let's take something like irrigation. Food, very important. Well, we need giant irrigation schemes with big dams, and then it turns out that if you go, again, I regret never being to South Asia. I always wanted to go, but it just never happened. But I've looked at bucket irrigation. Now we know what drip irrigation is, right? The Israelis developed it. It's very important in horticulture, flowers. You're growing food in East Africa or in different parts with just little drips of water. Well, that requires expensive technology, but if you have labor, you can just take a spoonful of water and put it on a plant. I've seen people doing this. I've seen people build irrigation systems out of mud, and it directs water for a season. Obviously, it's not going to stand up after the rains, but the point is we're often overshooting, and in part because governments want to say, this is a $10 billion project and we're going to do this, this, and this, but there are, and it's not simply saying, oh, I'm in favor of appropriate technologies. I mean, it's not that simple. There are certainly, your mobile infrastructure has to be a robust infrastructure. Your internet infrastructure must be robust, expensive. But there's a whole set of other areas where having more money doesn't get you better outcomes. And in the US, we know this in the biomedical field, that we spend 3 times what the Germans spend, and we know for sure we get worse health results. Now, we're not sure why, but we do spend triple what the Germans spend. We now spend 20% of our GDP on health. The Germans spend about 6.87. And of course, development goals, health is a big part of it. We don't even have development goals for health. That's supposed to be done by the private sector. So you do see these, to me, you see areas of food, agriculture, environment, and health that don't lend themselves to the Apollo model, to the Manhattan Project model. And this misleads people because they're thinking, the World Bank is thinking, we've got this cookbook that we can now localize, or Pakistanis or Cambodians, or they can own somehow, dressing it up in the way they want. But actually, when it comes to significant areas of life, there isn't a cookbook model. There are too many local factors. So physics on the one hand, and if you look at the structure of physics, the applied analog of physics, the inverse of physics, is electrical engineering. Similarly, I would challenge any social theorist to tell us, oh, there could have been different computers. You know what? Different mobile phones. That the convergence around the iPhone, the Samsung, the smartphone, or the laptop, or our use of Zoom, oh, that could have been 100 different ways. You know what? My belief from spending 40 years around the computer industry is, no, it can't. It's a lot like the physics situation where, there's a certain path to nuclear power. There's not 100 paths. There's a few, and there's a few paths to doing computers. You know, the best example I can come up with is the iPhone. The iPhone doesn't have a radio because Steve Jobs said, I don't want my phones to have a radio. They can't. He just declared, but you go to Africa, and I'm sure it's true elsewhere. Hey, somebody buys a phone, they expect it to have a radio in it. It costs about 30 cents, 50 cents to have a radio. And all over Africa, I can buy phones that cost $30, $50 to have a radio. And in the United States, there's not a single phone for sale that has a radio. Well, but this is still a minor socially constructed example. So I feel that physics and its inverse, electrical engineering, because really that's what electrical engineering is. It's the physical properties of stuff. And I don't believe there's that much variety. I mean, I used to say, you know, could there be, you know, it doesn't make any sense to argue that there would be vast differences in computing, say, or laptops or mobile phones. So my point is, we have these two powerful areas. One is historical, nuclear power. And then we have a more recent example, which is personal computing, small digital devices. And you go to China, you go to Korea, everybody does the same thing with these devices. Everybody does text messaging, everybody does mobile banking, and it just doesn't seem to matter. Unfortunately, that does not mean that all segments of life will work that way. And they won't. So, you know, and major areas, air quality, water quality, they would benefit a lot from having greater transparency. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to gauge the air quality in your office, in the bus you go to, just instantly? So there's a whole range of things that could be developed on top of these platforms, these digital platforms. But the digital platforms themselves seem global.
Thank you. Innoventures Global. Innoventures, are you going to ask a question?
Yeah, hi, Greg. Sorry, this is Athar. I couldn't change my name or my picture.
Oh, I like Reimagine. I like Reimagining Pakistan. Nothing against Pakistan today, but reimagining it, sure. Why not? And you're giving yourself plenty of time. 2047, sure. You're not going to do it next weekend. I like that. You've got 25 years to reimagine Pakistan. Well done.
Yeah, so
hey,
yeah, you need to have some time to reimagine things. You can't reimagine them on the fly. Yeah, my question is kind of also related with what Nadeem asked, which was, you know, you talked about the linear model and you talked about the Manhattan Project. And, you know, I'm a student of technology policy, so I've sort of read Vannevar Bush and all that material. So, you know, Pakistan has had its own kind of version of the Manhattan Project, which is our nuclear program and the missile program. But there, most of the development has happened, you know, kind of behind barbed wires, and there wasn't that kind of a spillover that was, you know, that was possible, for example, in the US. So I would like you to sort of comment on whether there was a debate at the time of the Manhattan Project and immediately afterwards about whether to keep this science under wraps or to let pieces of it outside with an explicit purpose to have civilian spillovers of that defense R&D. And so obviously, you know, we kind of know, you know, how the debate kind of played out, but whether there was a debate or not. And what would your advice be for the Pakistani context? You know, there is quite advanced science happening in Pakistan, but it is not making any impact on the civilian sector because it's not available to the civilian sector, right? So even, you know, in the UK, you know, in the US, for instance, you know, despite, you know, McCarthyism on one side, there was still a lot of openness with science. You couldn't spill, obviously, what was secret, but other than what was secret, so there's hardly any secret in basic science, right? So can you comment a little bit about the US context of whether there was a debate or not? And then in the Pakistani context, what would your advice be?
Yeah, well, first, I favor nuclear powered electricity. I'm not against it, I favor it. So you might say that the French example of state managed nuclear power networks worked very well. The US approach was unfortunately decentralized. The US government in the 50s, as you're saying, because the government said atoms for peace. So all your countries said atoms for peace. Sounds great. So one thing is, yes, there is a role for nuclear powered electricity. And if your profile around hydro would require a lot of extra electricity, I think nuclear power, it's fine. I think under the circumstances, electricity is super important. The single biggest benefit to development at one throw is electricity. The more electricity you can give people, the better they'll be. They'll figure out ways to use it. But your critique or your concern that the best and the brightest in the science establishment become captives of the military or become agents of security matters. Yeah, that's a real problem. And it's unfortunate because clearly, if there were more paths for scientists and engineers, young scientists and engineers to follow. So one thing to do is create more paths. You have to do it in a way that respects the problem of migration, because the one thing that the military scientists, they're generally not migrating. They don't have transferable skills, and they can't leave probably for some security reasons too. They can't just get up and go somewhere. So when you start training people, say in software and EE and biomedical and biomechanics, mobile telecom, purely civilian areas, you should address in advance the migration issue, because you've got to capture some of the benefits. Now, on a human level, it's great if you say a scientist can go with his family to Britain or the United States, but you have to capture their expertise that you've invested in. How do you do that? One way is to develop a cluster. So one approach would be, do you have something that might look like, in your reimagining exercise, is there a technological enclave? Is there a Silicon Valley, so to speak, or a Bangalore, so to speak? Is there a cluster? And what does that cluster do? Because it turns out that for most of the world, and this includes India, you're unlikely to be world-class across a wide area. So you're going to target, and maybe your educational system will target. So one thing that the ex-British colonies are very good at is producing lawyers. They're very good at producing lawyers. You have some of the best legal training, legal minds the world's ever seen. You have arcane legal disputes that are probably stunning in their complexity and beautiful in their expression. But lawyers don't produce food, don't make new computers, and so one is about status, civilian engineering heroes. You might promote the notion that there are heroes in different walks of life that can achieve status. This is a little bit of a personal issue of mine that I've done really over 40 years, because scientists, particularly physicists, have very high status, doctors, high status, but electrical engineers, civil engineers, they tend to be much lower. And there needs to be a better appreciation that theoretical knowledge, which is very important in the fields of nuclear, almost not important in the digital world, the biomedical world. Many people, I mean, you know, Pfizer's COVID vaccine, do they know why it works? How it works? Not really. It had to work, by the way. If they had put out a COVID vaccine that they understood perfectly, man, we just really understand how this works 60% of the time, well, that's Sinovac, okay? That's a Chinese vaccine. You know, Pfizer, whether they understood the vaccine or not, they had to have a vaccine working in the 90s. And so this is a very different posture as an engineer or as an innovator. You don't know. I mean, I'll tell you the truth. Nobody can explain why packet switching works. Nobody can explain that our videos, we seem to be seeing each other. They are sent through space, broken into little pieces, and reassembled in a snap. There's very little understanding of why that actually works, okay, from a scientific explanatory. But engineering wise, oh, we know if you take this device and that device and do this, it's all going to work. So the status of the practitioner must be elevated. So, and the status of the theoretician, the lawyer, and this starts with families. You know, it starts with families saying, hey, I'm happy if my child becomes, you know, a maker of something. And some of this is a legacy. I mean, look, no offense, Britain has the lowest percentage of its economy in manufacturing of Europe, the lowest percentage of food production of Western Europe, okay? The British don't want to make things, they don't want to grow things, and those are, they gave you a system, okay? And that system is wear a wig, go to a court, go to a fancy school, but don't touch anything. Come on. That's for other people. Other people touch stuff. We don't touch anything. So I think that it does involve a reimagining of our values. And the World Bank and IMF and international agencies are very reluctant because of the cultural crimes of the past, because of the cultural violence of the past. You were told, you know, people in the world were told they were inferior or this or that negative. So now, well, they don't want to say anything about your culture. Of course, you can talk about your own culture. You can talk about your own societies, but reimagining X, that's a path forward. And then technologies that help that reimagine take shape. One problem I ran into in sub-Saharan Africa was farming became very lucrative, and having a higher education, I don't mean becoming a professor or a superstar, but simply going to college alienated you, or university, alienated you from your roots, alienated you from farming, alienated you from productive work. That we continue to have educational systems, mostly in the former British colonies, that alienate talented people from not just valuable work, but work that could produce more income for themselves. That's the sad part. It's not that, oh, I think it's romantic to farm. Hey, in many parts of Africa, there are successful farmers who make far more money than, you know, a government clerk, say. So I think that you're raising a good, and it also relates to the bureaucracy element that Nadeem wrote. But I applaud your effort, and I would love you to email me so I can learn more about it. Definitely reimagine. Yes, that's a start. Very good.
Let me ask you one last question, Greg.
Yeah, and I know it's late there. I appreciate it.
Doesn't matter, but we enjoy listening to you. Greg, you raised the issue of the linear model and science, but I would argue with you, the linear model has been in place for a long time. If you go back and look at the one story that comes to mind is the longitude story.
Yeah.
That government passed a law to, give a price for longitude. So that's the linear model type thing too. But then through history, more or less, kings have kind of paid homage to science. The whole of Florence is littered with that. The Renaissance is littered with this. Even the Islamic civilization is littered with this. Given that, and it seems to me the model seems to be to find the best talent and kind of employ it and let it find things like Aristotle employed by Alexander and things like that. Okay, now putting all that in perspective, your final thoughts on what can Pakistan do for science policy? There is a great hullabaloo today about making a science policy. So give us your best thoughts. How should we make a science and technology policy for Pakistan?
Well, let me take some baby steps, because I do have some thoughts that I think have been tried by other countries. Singapore is very, very interesting. They have developed a science and technology inventory of people in the diaspora. Now, of course, it involves a certain amount of trust. You have to trust this government agency. They've learned about you. But one thing that Singapore did, and one of the benefits of this inventory is, so now you know that there are, let's just say 40,000 computer scientists, 50,000 PhDs in physical science, maybe even a skills inventory in technically non-engineering, but technical subjects. There are parts of marketing, there are parts of packaging, processing that are technical. How do you keep a factory running? I mean, that's not something that a high school student does. So you develop a skills inventory, and then for those people, you might find a way of communicating with them. This could be done on a city level. So one thing that you might do is there might be 3 or 4 cities in Pakistan that have exported a lot of talent, maybe because there's a big university there, or you just historically know. And you say, in addition to reimagine, you want to reconnect with these people. And remittances, of course, are one way of people showing they have concern. But there are many talented people in the West who are born in your country that have the capacity to maintain some kind of meaningful connection technologically. So that's one that I would think about. The other thing is to try in your education, in your structured secondary school, to try to either target, steer, reward students, the top students, to go into a broader spectrum of fields. When I would talk to, I had a long project for the National Science Foundation, funded me to do a project studying computer scientists in East Africa. There happened to be a lot of well-trained ones. Well, they would tell me that, they wanted to go to law school. They couldn't get in. They wanted to go to physics. They couldn't get in. And so you'll see that often very successful technical people are still laboring under the belief that, hey, they really should have been a physicist, or they could have been a lawyer, but they couldn't get in. And so that this issue of esteem and status, a better job of having national secondary school standards that make students realize that there are a broader menu of options for them to use their minds. And it may involve actually making and doing things that educated people can make and do things. Now on the state side, I think that broad approaches to science and technology, which I think Pakistan and South Asia generally have taken. My own view is that these broad approaches need to be supplemented by saying, you know what, we want to put the relatively small amount of money and resources into a few areas that we think have both some geographic resonance with us and might have some global, might have an ability to globally compete. So whether it's, you know, could be something around water or air quality or pretty much anything that involves building instruments, mastering them, gaining information about the world, but rather than a broad brush approach. Now, I will just say this without offending anybody, because I seem to have managed to go this long without it. Elites in many developing countries, and I would say yours is one, often the elites, I call it breed for export. Oh, I am an important person. I have to make sure that one or two of my children are able to get a job in Britain or the United States or Saudi Arabia so that, hey, we get some money, maybe I get to visit them, and their educational pursuits are influenced by their opportunities elsewhere. And I think this is another thing where the gentleman that talked about dreaming and reimagining, we've got to dream some different dreams for our talented children. Now, it's difficult because you don't want to brutally foreclose possibilities for individuals. However, one of the things we're seeing is some kind of convergence between professionals in different parts of the world in science and technical fields. And so maybe that helps a bit. But I do think that elites sometimes feel that this broad, global, cosmopolitan approach to science, oh, that's the one they want, because what's the point of raising a kid who now knows more about water in Pakistan than anybody else? That means they can only work in Pakistan. What's that about? And so I think that you know, there are soft campaigns around targets. Now, the other thing that India did that is much more difficult to do, but it did happen. Many of the first multinationals to go to India were led, the efforts were led by Indian Americans or Indians working in the United States for Hewlett Packard, for Intel, for Apple, for Google. I mean, same with China, that often the companies sent someone that seemed to be Chinese or seemed to be Indian, whereas the Koreans and the Japanese, oh, they sent a Korean. So, and I think you don't need to know much about Koreans to know how that's going to go. Okay, it often causes clashes. So some of the multinational led development is also can lead to this clustering, this focused innovation around. So in India's case, it's software in South India, but it's very tied to the multinational economy. In Taiwan, all those memory chip makers, all of them, they sell to the multinationals. Some extent China, but mostly the multinationals. So that's another stretch. But I like this notion of reimagining, of dreaming, of trying to broaden people's concepts of what a successful technical scientific person is.
Good. Greg, one final question just occurred to me as you were speaking. One point that came out when I read Joel Mokyer's book, for example, he talks about the Republic of Science. He talks about the Academy of Letters.
Right.
And the networks of science also come, or networks of thought also come out in Neil Ferguson's latest book. And I also remember reading about scientific history in the US. There's a pretty large role played by the academic communities like the American Science Association, the American Economic, whatever, all these associations. And the guilds in Europe played a large role too. So what role do you think do these networks play in science? And should a country invest in creating such networks of science?
Yes, that's a very good idea, absolutely. And it may be that they're not forming organically on their own. But within electrical engineering, within computer science, software, and then materials and processing, these are all distinct communities, and they associate freely and organize associations in societies that are more supportive of this. And it may need to be jump-started in where you are. So, I mean, we know you have a legendary group of lawyers in Pakistan that self-organize. So that it can't be antithetical to your culture to do this, but yet these are occupations that are newer and are performance-based. You know, when you're working for Microsoft and Google and you're working on, and somebody gives you a problem, you don't go, well, this is no problem. I went to Stanford. I'm sure I'll figure it out. I mean, nobody wants to hear what college you went to or what university. They want to see, can you solve the problem? And so these are problem solvers, but this is another soft culture, benign activity of raising the awareness of people that, hey, if you thought there were only 5 of you in your city, oh no, there's 500 of you. And maybe there's some way to raise the awareness of people around holding meetings, building communication, so that people know a little bit more about who's doing what and how that might grow. That would also help. Large employers sometimes are afraid to go to places that they don't think there'll be enough employee talent there. And so that inventory is useful to say, hey, look, you know, we have 500 people that can do C++ coding in my city. So we actually could support you. We actually could help you. But so that's, you know, but, you know, Joel Mokyr is very, very important economic historian. You're absolutely right that associations have had a huge, huge importance in liberal democracies where the state can't order people to do things. People have to freely choose to do them. And of course, you can use monetary compensation to incentivize people, but I think this is about self-conception. So what we, in the US, endlessly, the elite universities, you know, we'll just say there's hundreds of them, but the elite universities regularly have successful people from the private sector and to some extent from government agencies visit and have meetings with students and trying to let them know what the opportunities are in their area. And I think that often universities in developing countries, because they're so elite oriented, they can think that that's kind of demeaning. Why are they bothering us with a job? We're somebody special and important, and you know, we'll figure it out when we'll be employed by government. But so I think that you're absolutely right that associations are important. The other thing is cities are important. Cities innovate. So what's another problem with knowledge for development has been, it's a state-to-state approach. It's, we're this international agency or we're this nation and we're going to help your nation. Yeah, but really, if you look at the United States, of course, oh, there's a vast area in the middle where almost no innovation occurs, where almost no development is happening. It's all clustered. And we're used to even making distinctions between cities. And I think Europe did something very important in the EU with its secondary city-to-city programs that undercut the momentum that capital cities have. So that a city strategy, to me, to develop a development-oriented enclave of innovation, it starts in a city. And then you can often find that mayors and local officials have freedom to operate under the national radar and to develop some kind of personalities and some successes. And that's the biggest thing is, as you have successes, to document them. And successes in your technology and development space should be documented and shared. Not exaggerated, but documented and shared, because you have to break this reputational barrier. You have to break that down and begin to show to people that, yes, there's this umbrella that we call the United States, and it looks crazy, but down below it, there are innovators in cities that are moving at different paces. Anyway, this has been enjoyable, Nadeem, and I'm very, very pleased that I did it. I'm very pleased you invited me, and I was concerned that I would never find the right time. That meaning that it's 12 hours in advance, that I would be waiting. Your support team was great. I really appreciate the questions, and I'd be happy to interact with you and your colleagues again. And I appreciate any feedback you give me down the line when you reflect on it.
Thank you very much, Greg. This has been absolutely wonderful. We rely on people like you to show generosity towards us and teach our kids
Thank you.
something. So thank you very much. We will call upon you again if you allow us to.
Yeah. Well, now that we have a bit of a rapport through Zoom, thank you again so much. Thanks for the audience, and I really, really appreciate your supportive words.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you. All the best.
All right, Nadeem. Take care. Bye.